Welcome to Sonara's Deep Dive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are strapping in for a journey into one of the most compelling and utterly contradictory religious traditions of the ancient world.
I think contradictory is the perfect word for it.
We're going deep on Cybele, the Great Mother, known to the Romans as the Magna Mater, and her tragic consort, Attis.
This is truly a study in contrast, We are examining a deity whose worship was fully embraced, officially sanctioned by the powerful Roman state. She was a pillar of its imperial identity.
Right, a state goddess.
But then her core religious expression was defined by these ecstatic rites of public frenzy, self-flagellation, ritual bloodletting, and, of course, the most famous and controversial part, the self-castration performed by her priests, the Galli.
Wow. And that tension, that inherent mix between what the Romans saw as their own dignity and this perceived Asiatic chaos, that's the historical puzzle we're really here to solve.
It is.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're clearly not dealing with the predictable Olympian gods here.
Yeah.
This is something visceral. It's shocking. And we have a fantastic stack of sources to get into that granular detail.
We really do.
We've got historical analysis charting the cult's integration into Roman politics, some beautifully written, almost haunting classical poetry, especially from Catullus and Ovid.
And surprisingly, some really interesting scholarly essays, including one written by Martin Luther King Jr. in his theological studies that seriously look at the influence of these mystery religions on emerging Christianity.
So our mission today is to follow the entire arc of this goddess, both geographically and spiritually.
Right. We need to see her travel from the wild, untamed mountains of Anatolia, where she was this fundamental force of nature, all the way to the sophisticated political center of the Palatine Hill in Rome.
And along the way, we have to analyze the elaborate, and let's be honest, often hypocritical strategies the Romans used.
Exactly. They tried to contain these highly foreign or oriental elements of the cult, but at the same time, they were exploiting its spiritual power for their own political and imperial ends. It becomes this remarkable case study in how the Roman world was constantly negotiating the boundaries between what it considered civilized and what it is labeled barbaric.
Okay, so to really understand the Great Mother, the Magna Mater, we have to rewind centuries.
Yeah.
And we have to start far away from the marble temples of Rome, right? Into the rough terrain of Phrygia, which is modern-day Turkey.
Yeah, that's right.
What was her earliest, most primal identity there?
In Phrygia, her identity was primal, raw, and just absolutely elemental. She was known simply as the Mother of the Mountains, or Mater Rhea.
Oh, Mother of the Mountains.
Yeah, and the source material really emphasizes that she was conceived as the ultimate fundamental source of all life. And not just human life, but the vegetation, the beasts, the rivers. She was the personification of the unpredictable, dynamic powers of nature itself. She's the deep past, the primordial force.
And you can see that immense, untamed power immediately in her iconography. I mean, she is not a gentle, passive goddess.
Not at all. She is the Potnia Theron, the mistress of animals. And what's striking is her constant association with the most powerful of beasts, the lion.
The lion, they're key, aren't they?
Absolutely. She is often depicted flanked by massive lions. Sometimes they're just sitting in her lap. Other times they're literally drawing her chariot. And you have to understand, these aren't pets. They symbolize her absolute mastery over the wild, untamed natural world. She's the one force stronger than the kings of the jungle.
It's such a powerful image.
It is, and this iconography potentially links her back to even older Minoan and Mycenaean religious ideas, showing her connection to a very deep ancient tradition of these dominant female nature figures.
But the material centerpiece of her Phrygian worship, the sacred artifact they had at Pessinus, it wasn't a statue of a woman with lions at all. It was something, well, something far more ancient, far more cosmic.
Precisely. The cult object housed at Pessinus was an unshaped black stone, a piece of meteoric iron. This aniconic stone, a cosmic rock that literally fell from the sky, was revered as the oldest and most authentic image of the goddess herself.
Wow.
The sources note that stones like this are among the oldest symbols of the Great Mother Goddess across many cultures. It links Cybele's stone to these massive numinous sites of pre-organic life. The mountain, the cave, the stone. The sheer age and the otherworldly nature of that object must have been just awe-inspiring.
It grounds the cult not just in mythology, but in geology and the cosmos itself.
Yeah.
So from this raw Phrygian origin, how does she make the leap into the Greek world?
By about the 6th century BC, her cult began spreading to Greek colonies, and there she was known simply as Mater Mother or Kubileya. And the Greeks, being very culturally pragmatic, they quickly integrated her into their own pantheon.
So they didn't see her as the threat then. They weren't afraid of this foreign goddess.
Not at all. They categorized her, they just filed her away. They connected her immediately to their Titan mother, Rhea, calling her Mohurthin, the mother of the gods.
Okay, that makes sense.
But they also drew strong parallels with Demeter, the grain goddess. And that was because of the shared theme of devoted motherhood and the cycle of death and revival that you see in the Attis myth. Demeter grieved for Persephone, who went to the underworld. Cybele grieved for Attis, who died under the pine. That theme of seasonal loss and return was very familiar to them.
And this cultural integration eventually led to her becoming a pretty respectable figure in Greek civic life.
Oh, yes. In Greek cities, her temples, called metroa, became key civic institutions. For instance, the sources point out that the metroon in Athens, which was located right next to the town council, the boule.
So right in the heart of the city.
Right in the center of power. And it functioned not just as a religious sanctuary, but it actually doubled as the state archive.
The state archive. In a temple to a foreign goddess.
That's right. And this indicates a remarkable level of acceptance. She was one of the central, respected deities sacrificed to by the state counselors, standing right alongside Zeus and Athena. This gave her foreign cult immense cultural prestige even before Rome ever encountered her.
But the real moment she shifted from a regional deity to a global player was her arrival in Rome, where she was branded the Magna Mater. And this wasn't some gentle invitation. This was a desperate act of military and spiritual necessity.
It absolutely was. It was during the most terrifying period of the Roman Republic, the Second Punic War, around 204 BC. Hannibal was wreaking havoc in Italy. Prodigies, these unexplained omens of disaster, were rampant, famine threatened, and Rome faced the imminent threat of being wiped off the map. In their desperation, the Senate consulted the Sibylline oracle.
And the oracle delivered a clear, if maybe a little shocking, message.
It was very clear. Rome could only defeat the foreign invader if the foreign goddess, the Magna Mater, was brought from Phrygian Pessinus, which was then under the allied kingdom of Pergamum. The divine instruction was unambiguous. You have to get the cosmic rock to save the Republic.
So the arrival itself becomes legendary. Ovid recounts it in wonderful detail, doesn't he?
He does. The black meteoric stone was transported by sea. The ship carrying it, the Navis Salvia, was supposedly made of her sacred pine wood, and it arrived at the mouth of the Tiber. But then, legend claims, the ship became hopelessly grounded in the mud. A terrible omen.
And this is where the political spectacle really kicks in.
Yeah.
To cement Roman acceptance of this whole thing.
Absolutely. A Roman matron named Claudia Quinta, whose public reputation and chastity had been questioned, stepped forward. She supposedly used only her sash, and she miraculously pulled the ship free, dragging this massive vessel back into the channel.
Just with her sash.
That's the story. And this act instantly proved her innocence, and crucially, it validated the sacred power of the goddess in the eyes of the Roman people. It demonstrated that this deity was willing to work through Roman virtue.
So she arrives as a foreign savior, but Rome immediately launches this intense strategic PR campaign to make her Roman. They position her as an ancient ancestral figure.
And this is the genius of Roman political religious strategy. They created what the sources call a religio-political bridge. Roman mythographers conveniently positioned her as an ancestral Trojan goddess Magna Mater Diorum Idea, or the great mother of the gods from Mount Ida.
By connecting her to Mount Ida, the legendary location of Troy, and therefore to the founder of Rome, Aeneas.
Exactly.
And the Aeneid really seals this historical lie, doesn't it?
It does. Virgil, writing later, solidifies this connection. He claims that Aeneas's ships were built from her sacred pine tree. This whole maneuver provided Rome with this deep, pseudo-historical connection to the intellectual and cultural power of the Greek Near East. It integrated her into their identity, and perhaps most importantly, it legitimized their future imperial expansion by making the East seem ancestral to the West.
But this adoption was just fraught with anxiety. I mean, Rome wanted the powerful mother figure, they wanted the political validation, but they absolutely did not want the frenzy, the noise, or the gender transgression.
That is the core enduring tension of this whole cult. While she was given a magnificent temple on the Palatine Hill, a central, respected location, there were incredibly strict initial restrictions during the Republican era. Roman citizens were explicitly forbidden from participating in her more ecstatic rites.
And critically, from becoming her priests, the Galli.
Critically, They confined those shocking foreign elements to the temple's enclosure. They maintained a clear legal separation between Roman dignity, which was defined by self-control and masculinity, and what they viewed as this Oriental religious excess.
It really sounds like they imported the symbol of power while attempting to quarantine the practice itself.
That's a perfect description. They absorbed the power of the goddess while attempting to filter out the cultural contamination that they felt was represented by her most dedicated priests.
The quarantine, however, only really worked on the surface because the core of the cult's annual cycle depended entirely on the shocking myth of her consort. We cannot talk about Cybele without understanding the profound tragedy of Attis.
No, Attis is the dramatic anchor of the cult. He's Cybele's romantic consort in the Phrygian and Greek traditions, and he's typically portrayed as this stunningly beautiful, youthful shepherd. His tragedy provides the necessary mythological script for the cult's most intense, visceral rituals.
And the core myth, which is famously preserved by Ovid, is a powerful tale of obsessive love and broken faith. Cybele, the goddess of everything, loved Attis intensely and demanded he remain her eternally celibate priest.
But Attis, being mortal and young, broke his vow. He fell for and pursued a river nymph. The sources describe Cybele's reaction not just as anger, but as a divine, overwhelming fury.
A fury that drove him literally mad.
Literally mad. And this divine madness, this frenzy, it reflects the very style of worship used by the cult.
Right, the ecstasy.
Exactly. So in this state of ecstasy and madness, Attis performed the central, shocking, and defining act of the cult. Self-castration beneath a pine tree. He bled out and died from his wounds. And this act of self-mutilation becomes the profound, transformative center of the entire religion.
And the pine tree itself becomes sacred because of this loss. So why did Cybele choose to transform him? What was the meaning there?
Well, she was overwhelmed by this inconsolable grief, and she prevented his total loss by transforming his body into a sacred fir tree. The evergreen nature of the tree and its fruit, the pine cones, came to symbolize Attis's death, his incorruptibility, and his potential for renewal. The tree symbolizes not just their relationship, but the relationship between death and life in the natural world.
Okay, and here is where the myth really became a tool for Roman cultural identity. We mentioned Catullus' poem 63 before. It's an extraordinary piece of Roman literature, and it was used to draw a very sharp cultural line.
Catullus' poem is incredibly significant because it fundamentally portrays Attis as a figure of cultural betrayal and regression. The poem doesn't depict him as some poor, confused shepherd. It shows him as an educated, non-Asian man who chooses to abandon civilization for this frenzied cult.
And after the self-castration, the frenzy passes, and Attis looks out at his new life and realizes what he has lost.
Exactly. And the things he laments losing are not trivial. He laments forsaking the institutions that define Roman life. The forum, the palastra, the racecourse, and gymnasium.
That's a very specific list.
It's a highly deliberate list. By lamenting the loss of these public, structured, masculine Roman institutions, Catullus is constructing an ideological juxtaposition. He is placing the ordered, disciplined civilization of Rome against the wild, feminizing, chaotic East Phrygia.
So the poem effectively splits the cult in two. The Great Mother is acceptable because she's Trojan and therefore, Roman adjacent. But her rituals are terrifying because they represent the cultural annihilation of the vir, the ideal Roman man.
Absolutely. The literary purpose of Catullus is deeply imperial. By portraying Attis's self-castration and grief as a cultural regression, it validates Roman imperialism as a civilizing mission. The message is, we must rule the East, otherwise the East will corrupt us. It justifies that initial Roman fear and containment of the Gallic priesthood.
Moving back to the religious significance, though, Attis is clearly a vegetation deity. His death is intrinsically linked to the fertility of the land.
That is his fundamental identity, yes. His death is what introduced mortality to the natural world. And so his restoration or renewal symbolizes the annual cycle of nature's death in the winter and its vital rebirth in the spring.
And this is where the interpretation gets complicated for later historians, particularly those analyzing potential religious syncretism.
It does.
We have to address the caution the sources provide regarding the language of resurrection. Why do scholars warn us against using terms like dying and rising God?
It's crucial to maintain scholarly rigor and avoid anachronism. The majority of serious scholarship counsels extreme caution against applying Christian terminology like resurrection because the original myth's meaning was so profoundly bound up in the seasonal metaphorical cycle.
It wasn't a one-time event.
No, the sources clearly indicate that Cybele could only preserve his dead body. There are mentions of his hair continuing to grow or his little finger still moving. So an incorruptibility, a prevention of complete decay or transformation into the sacred fir tree. The return was symbolic, the return of vegetation, not a historical singular bodily restoration.
So using the word resurrection risks exaggerating the similarities between this cyclical pagan concept and the later historical claims of Christian theology.
Precisely. The sources warn that misapplying the terminology risks conflating concepts and obscures the unique characteristics of both traditions. The Attis myth explains the rhythm of the year. It doesn't necessarily promise personal, eternal salvation in the same vein as later mystery cults or Christianity did.
So if the myth provides the tragic script, the rituals provide the intense, visceral experience that captivated, terrified, and, let's be honest, scandalized the Roman populace. This was not a silent service. This was pure, unadulterated noise and frenzy.
The worship was profoundly ecstatic. It was designed specifically to induce trance states, divine possession, and prophecy. And this required an overpowering sensory experience, relying heavily on loud, rhythmic, percussive instrumentation.
Let's talk about that soundscape. What instruments were creating this environment of frenzy?
The big one was the tympanon, a massive round hand drum beaten with incredible force. Alongside that, you had clashing cymbals, bronze castanets, and the deep, unsettling notes of the curved double flute, the allos, which was famously difficult to play and produced a sound associated with the wild and the non-Greek.
You can just visualize the scene, the priests, the galley moving in this frenzied rhythmic dance, the ululations, the sheer pounding noise designed to overwhelm the senses and induce a form of divine madness or mania.
Yes, the goal was intoxication and transcendence, and this was amplified by the presence of the Phrygian curates, these armed dancers who would leap and strike their brazen shields.
Which recalls the myth of the original curates, who clashed their shields to protect the infant Zeus from Saturn.
Exactly. It suggests that the noise and the ritualized movement were ancient techniques used to defend, transform, or access the divine.
And the high point of this frenzy, tied directly to the myth of Attis's self-mutilation, was the most shocking of the blood rituals.
That would be the Dies Sanguinis, the Day of Blood. It was held on March 24th, following the mourning period. And this was a day of intense devotion and self-mortification. Devotees would engage in self-flagellation, whipping themselves and ritualistically cutting their arms to sprinkle their own blood onto the altar or sometimes onto the pine effigy of Attis,
symbolizing their participation in his suffering.
It's a symbolic substitution in a way. This act of self-wounding holds a strong connection to sacrifice. And on this most dramatic day, the high priest himself, who is impersonating Attis, drew blood from his own arm.
So the high priest does it as well.
He does, and this singular act served as a symbolic sacrifice in place of a human victim, completing the cycle of suffering and redemption. And it's this symbolic shedding of blood by the high priest of Attis that the theologian Martin Luther King Jr. specifically noted.
Right, he drew a parallel.
He drew a parallel to the epistle to the Hebrews concerning Christ being the high priest who obtains eternal redemption by his own blood. The idea of blood sacrifice leading to ultimate redemption was a powerful, shared cultural concept.
Now let's talk about a later addition to the cult, one that the Roman elite embraced. It was less about self-mutilation and more about expensive spectacle. The Taurobolium.
The Taurobolium, the bull slaughtering, was a very significant ritual, but it was a late adoption. It started in the 160s AD, likely popularized under emperors like Antoninus Pius. This was a public, bloody, high-status animal sacrifice.
Sometimes they used a ram, the Creobolium.
Right. And crucially, this was the mystery initiation ritual that allowed Roman citizens, who were forbidden from becoming Galli, to fully participate in the deeper mysteries of the cult.
And the physical setup of this rite is just stunning. Can you describe the experience of the initiate?
It was designed for maximum dramatic impact. The initiate, often wearing a toga, would descend into a pit, the fossa dug in the ground, a kind of symbolic grave.
So you're in a hole in the ground.
You are. And above the pit was a massive perforated wooden platform. A huge, costly bull was led onto that platform and ritually slaughtered. The blood, sometimes described as hot, dark rivulets, streamed down through the perforations, bathing the initiate completely.
That's an intense, visceral baptism. What was the spiritual outcome supposed to be?
The blood was believed to purify them of sins, to literally wash away their past and grant them a form of spiritual rebirth. The language used by the initiates and witnesses was powerful. They were said to be renatus in aeternum, born again into eternity through this blood baptism.
A much more individualistic salvation than traditional state religion offered.
Exactly.
But this raises a fascinating historical puzzle that the sources highlight. Cybele is the goddess of lions. Attis is associated with the shepherd and the ram. Why use a bull for the most important purification ritual, the Torobolium?
It is genuinely puzzling. Bulls were the most potent and most expensive sacrificial victim in Roman religion, which certainly speaks to the elite status of the rite. But spiritually, it seems contradictory. Scholars note that if you look at Cybele's iconography, the lions are frequently shown dominating or attacking bulls. So that might suggest the bull symbolized a wild, untamed force that the goddess was bringing under submission.
So the bull could be a representation of a subordinated force offered to the mother of the mountains.
That's one interpretation. Another intriguing possibility the sources suggest is that the Torobolium may have derived from older hunting rituals, where the bull is the ensnared animal brought to submission before the huntress goddess. Even the hooked sword used in the rite, the ensis hametus, is sometimes referred to by poets as a hunting spear, a venabulum.
So the bull sacrifice is less about rebirth and more about the goddess conquering raw, earthly power.
It could be. It's a rich historical contradiction that really speaks to the blending of traditions in this cult over time.
That intensity wasn't just random. It was structured within a massive, highly public calendar. This complex, multi-day arc came to dominate Rome's spring religious calendar, providing a deep emotional journey for the devotees.
Right. This complex festival, which we often refer to as Attis's Holy Week, was formalized and made public primarily under the Emperor Claudius in the imperial period. It spans nearly 2 weeks, and it moves the worshiper through the entire cycle of Attis's life, death, and return.
Okay, let's chronologically map this progression. Where does it start?
The journey begins on March 15th with the Cana Intrat, which means the reed enters. This commemorates Attis's birth and his exposure being found in the river reeds along the Phrygian river Sangarius.
A quiet beginning.
Very quiet. The festival began with the canophores, or reed bearers, gathering and ceremonially carrying the reeds. It's a day about origins and fragility.
So a quiet start, but the mood shifts pretty quickly towards tragedy.
It does. On March 22nd, the tone turns dramatically somber with the arbor intrat, or the tree enters. This commemorates the central tragedy, Attis's death under the pine tree. The dendrophores, or tree bearers, would dramatically cut down a pine tree, decorate it, suspend an image of Attis from it, and carry it in a massive procession to the temple on the Palatine Hill amidst loud ritual lamentations.
I imagine this procession was designed to be deeply moving. It's the visual representation of Attis's body, really.
It was a solemn, mournful spectacle. The tree was treated like a corpse, and the days immediately following were a time of intense, formal mourning. And this solemnity allows the build-up to the sheer emotional and physical outpouring of the Day of Blood.
Which brings us to March 24th, the culmination of the grief.
That's the Dies Sanguinis, the Day of Blood. This is the peak of the frenzy we discussed. The self-flagellation, the wild dancing, the self-cutting by the devotees, and the blood sacrifice by the high priest. The chaos peaks with the ritual placement of Attis's effigy into a tomb, recreating his death and burial. It is a day of ritual despair and physical offering.
But the very next day is the moment of ultimate relief. The mourning gives way to unbridled joy.
Yes. March 25th is the glorious turning point, the Hilaria, which literally means rejoicing. This day celebrated Attis's divine rebirth, coinciding with the vernal equinox on the Roman calendar. Damascus, a later philosopher, described this day as a complete liberation from Hades.
So total celebration.
Total celebration. It was marked by general jubilation, dressing up in masks, feasting, and the ceremonial return of the effigy from the tomb, followed by a communal sacramental meal.
And the sources, particularly those MLK Jr. referenced, place great weight on this specific date and progression, don't they?
They do. The celebration of the empty tomb and the rejoicing on the third day, March 25th, was a powerful parallel noted by early Christian writers. In areas like Phrygia, Gaul, and Italy, where Attis worship was entrenched, the sources confirm that local Christians adapted the date of March 25th as the anniversary of Christ's Passion. It's a direct example of chronological overlap and syncretism in the early empire.
So after the emotional peak of the Hilaria, the festival cycle concludes with a cleansing ritual.
That's the lavatio, or washing, on March 27th. This ritual was highly public. It involved a massive procession taking Cybele's sacred meteoric stone and her other sacred implements, like the cymbals and flutes, down in state to the Almo stream, a tributary of the Tiber.
What happened there?
There, a red-robed priest would bathe the stone in the Phrygian manner, dramatically reenacting her original clean arrival in Rome years earlier. It's a purification that resets the goddess's image after the chaos of the mourning period.
And the final day of the cycle.
March 28th is the Initium Chiani. This is interpreted by scholars as the date for the secret, private initiations into the deeper mysteries of Matar and Attis, often held at the Gaianum Sanctuary near the Vatican Hill.
So this is where the public spectacle transitions into personal commitment.
Exactly. It allowed initiates to gain that deep personal spiritual connection beyond the state-approved public rites.
So we have this incredible, intense cycle of death and rebirth, frenzy and celebration spanning 2 weeks. But this stands in stark contrast to the original state-approved holiday dedicated to the goddess, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The ecstatic March cycle was always set against the older, more respectable celebration. The Megalesia, held annually around April 4th to the 10th, the Megalesia focused on public games, theatrical performances, often plays based on the Attis myth, but cleaned up for Roman taste and solemn processions. This was the state-approved, aristocratic face of the cult, designed to reinforce the image of the Matar as an orderly, politically useful deity, deliberately avoiding the blood and frenzy that define the March rites.
This conflict between the state's need for order and the cult's core identity really came to a head in the form of its priests. The Galli were the living embodiment of everything the traditional Roman man, the vir, was taught to fear and despise.
The Gallis are just essential to understanding this cult's tension. They were male-born priests who performed self-castration, sometimes ritually on the dies sanguinis.
And because of that, they violated Roman legal standards.
Completely. They were legally forbidden from holding Roman citizenship and the rights of inheritance. They had to subsist largely as wandering mendicants, depending on alms received while performing their frenzied shoot rites.
And their appearance, as described in the sources, was probably the most transgressive element in Rome. It was a complete rejection of Roman standards of masculine discipline and moderation.
A total reversal. The sources describe them wearing this notorious effeminate attire, long, oiled hair, often dyed or powdered, bright, flowing robes, copious amounts of jewelry, heavy makeup, wigs. They adopted a feminine gait, a soft way of walking and speaking, everything antithetical to Roman virtus, manly virtue.
And Roman writers just scorned them.
They called them degenerate, weak, unmanly.
Yet, despite being scorned, they held this powerful religious status. They weren't simply outcasts, were they?
No, and that's the paradox. They were objects of intense religious awe. They were state priests, technically sacred and inviolate. Their self-mutilation, while legally disqualifying, consecrated them in this terrifying way.
So what does that mean for how we understand Roman society?
Well, their existence forces us to examine the Roman sex-gender dynamic. Scholars have noted that the Galli provided a space for what we might interpret today as an ill-defined third gender in the ancient world individuals who embraced identities outside the male-female binary.
So the cult was inherently appealing to those experiencing gender variance.
It seems likely. The role provided a religious sanction for gender expression that was otherwise socially impossible. By categorizing the Galli as foreign and other, Romans could examine questions of masculinity and gender transgression without threatening the rigidly defined boundaries of their own society. They could watch the spectacle, be terrified by it, but then reassure themselves that it was just some Oriental custom.
The cultural horror of the self-castrated priest was so pervasive that the Romans even sought alternative, less frenzy-driven origins for the act itself.
That brings us to the fascinating alternative foundation myth, particularly popular in Hierapolis in Syria, the story of Combabus.
Okay, tell us about Combabus.
Combabus was a trusted hero assigned to escort Queen Stratonus on a long journey, and knowing that the queen would likely find him attractive, and perhaps fearing his own moral weakness.
He wanted to guarantee his innocence.
To absolutely guarantee his innocence and honor, he castrated himself before the journey began. He placed his severed genitals in a sealed box, and he handed it to the king as irrefutable, secret proof of his perpetual honor and commitment.
That completely reframes the act, from divine madness to an act of moral necessity and self-control.
Precisely. He was later falsely accused of seducing the queen, but he triumphantly produced the box, proved his innocence, and was rewarded with great honors.
And the female dress.
The myth claims Combabus adopted female dress later, not out of ecstatic zeal, but because a foreign woman fell hopelessly in love with him, and he changed his attire permanently to ensure he would never unintentionally mislead or deceive any woman again. This narrative provides a noble, pragmatic, and highly defensible reason for both the castration and the feminine presentation.
And what does that anecdote tell us about the Roman mindset?
It just illustrates the Roman and Near Eastern anxiety to find a rational, moral, and non-frenzied explanation for a practice they found deeply disturbing. The story provides a sense of order to the chaos. It suggests that while the Galli might perform the act in ecstasy, the act itself could be justified by honor and necessity.
So, to successfully integrate this cult into the rigid structures of the state, Rome had to address the legal problem. How can the high priest of a state cult be someone who violates Roman law? They had to create a political firewall.
And they executed a brilliant piece of legal engineering, the creation of the senior priestly office of the Archigallus. This office was reliably attested from the Antonine era, though possibly earlier. The Archigallus was explicitly a Roman citizen and, crucially, was not a eunuch.
And this solved the fundamental conflict.
It did. It maintained the dignity of Roman law, which forbade citizens from self-castration, while allowing a high-ranking citizen, a vir, to oversee and manage the foreign cult and its finances. The Archigallus became the Roman bureaucratic face of the cult, integrating it into the state religious structures while remaining legally and culturally safe.
And this high-ranking figure often presided over the initiation of the elite, non-castrating ritual, the Toribolium.
Exactly. The Archigallus was often depicted on reliefs with the traditionally effeminate long hair of the Galli, but his legal status remained intact. His existence facilitated the integration of the cult, providing Roman elites with a way to gain spiritual rebirth without sacrificing their manhood or their citizenship.
So, on the ground, the cult presented this extraordinary duality, a shocking public spectacle coexisting with a quiet, daily intimacy.
It was profoundly dualistic. On one hand, you had the loud, frantic street parades, the noisy music, and the mendicant Galli, the begging for money during the Megalesia, a constant source of public curiosity and scandal. But on the other, there was the essential, quiet relationship ordinary people maintained.
What did that look like?
Small household shrines dedicated to the mother, offerings of incense, wine, and flowers, and personal prayers directed toward the powerful goddess for fertility and protection. Despite the scorn poured on them by the Roman intellectual elite, the Galli were actively sought out by ordinary people in city streets. People interacted with them daily, seeking blessings, minor magic, and oracles. It was a goddess of the high estate and the lowest street corner all at once.
This ancient cult, imported during a time of crisis, continually forced Rome to confront its own definition of identity. What does the evidence tell us about the ultimate success of Rome's strategy of containment? Did they successfully isolate the foreign elements?
The strategy was successful in terms of imperial control, but it created this enduring cultural anxiety. The Roman oligarchy shrewdly embraced the useful Trojan origin of the Magna Mater, the dignified, ancestral, politically advantageous element, but they simultaneously lived in fear of the cultural attack represented by the ecstatic, gender-transgressive Galli and the rites of frenzy.
And this fear mirrored Rome's broader anxieties about its soldiers and citizens going native in the East.
Exactly.
And Roman literature, as we discussed with Catullus, was explicitly used to maintain this arbitrary cultural barrier.
Absolutely. Writers like Virgil and Catullus worked hard to reinforce this divide, effectively splitting the cult into its Roman parts, which were orderly, aristocratic, and politically useful, and its barbaric parts, chaotic, transgressive, and requiring containment. This literary effort was essential for maintaining the ideological justification for Roman imperialism by defining the Orient as a debased space ripe for Roman civilizing rule.
We have to turn our attention now to the striking historical parallels drawn between the Magna Mater and Attis cult and emerging Christianity. And we have to maintain our strict mandate of impartial reporting on the sources.
This comparison is crucial for understanding religious history, and our sources, including that remarkable 1949 essay by Martin Luther King Jr., provide a robust framework. Chronologically, we see an explicit localized overlap. The sources confirm that in many areas where Attis worship was entrenched, Phrygia, Gaul, Italy, Christians adapted the date of the Attis festival, March 25th, as the traditional anniversary of Christ's Passion.
And that date, March 25th, was the Hilaria, the day of rejoicing following the burial and the discovery of the empty tomb.
Precisely. And the ritual similarities are compelling. The festival arc included the theme of a deity who was symbolically slain and hanged on a tree, the effigy fastened to the pine on March 22nd, followed by burial in a tomb, the discovery of the empty tomb on the third day, and culminating in the Hilaria and a sacramental meal. This progression certainly offered familiar cultural markers to those converting from paganism.
And the sacrificial parallels are perhaps the most theologically potent similarity noted in the source analysis.
They are. We return to the Die Sanguinis. The high priest of Attis drew blood from his own arm, symbolically sacrificing himself instead of a human victim to secure some form of redemption. Martin Luther King Jr.'s analysis in particular highlights the powerful connection the sacrificial shedding of blood had to the biblical narrative in the Epistle to the Hebrews.
Which describes Christ as the high priest.
The high priest who, by his own blood, obtains eternal redemption for humanity. The structural role of the sacrificial high priest is strikingly similar.
But the sources also deliver critical, necessary warnings regarding these comparisons. Correlation does not equal causation.
The critical perspective is vital for the learner. Many scholars caution that the alleged similarities, like a true bodily resurrection, sacred meals, or the specific use of rebirth terminology, might be exaggerated. Often this is because early modern scholars carelessly described late pagan rites using Christian language.
And the chronology is a problem.
The chronology is a huge problem. It undermines a direct influence on the New Testament. Many of the most explicit parallels are only attested in very late pagan texts after AD 100, suggesting they may have been late pagan elaborations influenced by Christianity, rather than the other way around.
So the theme of resurrection existed, but the nature of the resurrection was fundamentally different.
Yes. Attis's rebirth was tied to the mythical, non-historical, cyclical return of vegetation, designed to explain the seasons. This contrasts fundamentally with the early Christian claim of a singular historical bodily resurrection of Christ, which was meant to be a unique, unrepeatable event breaking the cycle of time.
Finally, despite its incredible political power, state sanction, and popularity, at its height rivaling the cults of Mithras and Isis, the cult of Cybele and Attis eventually faced increasing repression.
By the late Empire, paganism was on the defensive. The Aenean decrees banned public worship, and the last known reference to the official temple's dedication in Rome was around AD 390.
But it didn't just disappear.
No, the spiritual tenacity of the cult was truly remarkable. We have the vivid testimony of St. Augustine, writing decades after Christianity became the sole imperial religion. He still witnessed the Galli parading through the squares and streets of Carthage with oiled hair and powdered faces, languid limbs, and feminine gait. It demonstrates that the priesthood and its spectacular transgressive rituals persisted long after its official end. #tag outro.
What an extraordinary historical negotiation. The cult of Cybele and Attis shows us a powerful, ancient mother goddess imported under the highest political duress to save Rome. Yet her core practices and her most dedicated priests embody the exact barbaric elements, the frenzy, the blood, the transgressive gender expression that the Romans continually sought to banish or contain.
The cult of Cybele and Attis proves that cultures are complex, messy, and constantly evolving. The formidable Roman identity wasn't built monolithically. It was constructed through these anxious negotiations, requiring the empire to strategically absorb elements claimed to despise, the oriental and the transgressive, precisely to define and reinforce its own sense of aristocratic, civilizing identity. It was a necessary tension.
So here's a provocative thought for you, the learner, to carry forward.
The story of the Galli shows us that society's negotiation of boundaries, particularly those relating to gender, spectacle, and identity, is constant and cyclical. Just as the Romans struggled for centuries to reconcile the spectacular and transgressive Galli with their deeply held accepted norms of ver, contemporary society continues to grapple with what it defines as sacred or profane when individuals express identities and behaviors that fall outside rigid traditional structures. The cultural anxiety and public debate we see today over expression, identity, and the body is in many ways just a new iteration of the ancient struggle the Romans faced on the Palatine Hill 2 millennia ago.
Thanks for tuning into Sonara's Deep Dive. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of our future episodes. I bring you fresh content every week. Thanks for listening.